All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this book talk with Maine Historical Society. Today is August 10th, 2020. My name is Kathleen Newman. I'm the Manager of Education and Public Programs at Maine Historical Society, coming to you from my home office in Maine this evening. And with us this evening is Fergus Bordewich, author of Congress at War. And he is here to launch this new book with us in Maine and to talk a little bit about the book, its local connections to Maine history, and to answer some of your questions. Now, Fergus is the author of 7 previous nonfiction books, including The First Congress, How James Madison, George Washington, and a Group of Extraordinary Men Invented the Government, America's Great Debate, Henry Clay, Stephen A. Douglas, and the Compromise That Preserved the Union, Bound for Canaan, the Underground Railroad and the War for the Soul of America, and Washington, the Making of the American Capital. He lives in San Francisco, and I believe that's where he's joining us from tonight. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Well, thank you, Kathleen. Thanks so much for the invitation. And the same to the Maine Historical Society. And it's nice to be with you, even in my imagination, in your lovely city of Portland, which I like a great deal and got to know a little bit when I was doing research for this book, though that was primarily at Bowdoin College in the papers of the wonderful William Pitt Fessenden, whom I'm going to talk about. When we get to the question time, I'm open to anything anybody wants to bring up. So please don't hesitate if you have something to ask. In fact, I think I will just open this with a quote from William Pitt Fessenden, which happens to be the very first thing you read in the book on the frontispiece. It's a great quote. "I would not have perfect quiet always. In a republic especially, you never find quiet except in a tyranny." This is a wonderful, wonderful quote. And this book is it's a political history of Congress during the Civil War. It's Congress during the Civil War. Kathleen, let's get a picture.
You ready for the slides? Yep.
Folks have something to look at.
Hold on 1 second. I'm going to share my screen, and you should see those coming up.
These pictures that'll be coming up, let's go to Fort Sumter. There we go. We'll stay with Fort Sumter for a moment or two. What I want to do with these pictures is just to give you a sense of what the atmosphere is, the moment of the war, what things looked like, at least through artists' eyes, and you'll see some interesting photographs as well. I think, I want you to have something atmospheric here while I'm talking about this time. Of course, the Civil War begins in April of 1861 with this event, South Carolina troops firing on federal Fort Sumter. And from then on, it's going to be 4 years of bloodshed. Kathleen, let's go to the next one. This next image shows you what happened immediately afterward. What you see here is federal troops, volunteers from the state of Massachusetts, who have come in a hurry, literally running in this picture, to Washington. That's the Capitol building in the upper right-hand corner. They're not in a battle, they're training. And Washington, bear in mind, was right on the border between the slave states and the free. In fact, it is encased in 1861 in 2 slave states, Maryland and Virginia. There's panic. There's panic in Washington. There's panic across the North that Confederates will seize Washington right at the beginning of the war. Wasn't. There were about 500 armed troops in Washington. The U.S. Army had a total of about 16,000 men, and they were nearly all on the western frontier in forts. So Washington, Lincoln, and Congress put out a desperate call for the various governors to send troops to defend Washington. And the first ones in were these men from Massachusetts. Let's go to the next image, Kathleen. This is the US Capitol, which looks familiar and not so familiar, because in 1861, the Great Dome was under construction, just like this. And it's a wonderful, though somewhat disturbing symbol, I think, of the incomplete Union. Strewn all around the grounds, by the way, were blocks of marble, like the fractured bits of the Union. 11 states have left by the spring of 1861. Will the Capitol ever be completed? Will the Union ever be reunited? It's an open question. Nobody really knows the outcome. Let's go to the next one, Kathleen. Here we are. Now, I'm going to keep this one up for a little while, because this is the arena in which most of my book takes place, which is to say, it is the floor of Congress, in this case, the House of Representatives. And it's very evocative. Believe it or not, there are very, very few images, very few, showing Congress active or in session from the war period, Civil War period. But anyway, this is a great one because you see somebody over on the left, I think it might be Thaddeus Stevens, I'm not sure, delivering a speech. You see somebody else sort of in the middle of the picture, looking as if he's going to rush at somebody else in the center to attack him. You see a few people, if you look carefully, a few members actually reading newspapers with their feet up on the desks. They've seen this all before. And up, this is significant, up at the top of the picture, it's a little fuzzy, but what you're seeing is the galleries, which were packed with citizens. The biggest show in town was the US Congress. People came from all over to see Congress in action. And it communicates something that I wanted to do with my book, which is to say that the political history of the Civil War is not dull. It was dynamic, it was contentious, feverish even. Every issue that was important to the country was debated on the floor of Congress. And not only to fellow members, but for the first time in American history, members are speaking to the entire country via one, newspapers, which are booming in the 1860s, and two, via the telegraph, which means that debates on the floor of Congress reach every tavern and church and farmstead in America within hours. So it was like the internet of the day, even though it may seem antiquated to us now. So bear in mind that in 1861, war has begun, and nobody knows what's going to happen. The outcome is not a foregone conclusion. South and North, people by and large think it may last maybe even a few weeks, a few months at most. Nobody, almost nobody, imagines 4 years of unrelenting bloodshed, fear, despair, and near defeat for the Union. Meanwhile, Congress faces a multitude of existential challenges. How can the North be mobilized for a war of unimaginable magnitude? Eventually, the federal armies will have 2 million men, from 16,000 to 2 million. Was Congress or the president responsible for leading the war effort? This was not clear at all. And it would be there would be a tug of war between the White House and Capitol Hill, as there so often is in history, over who actually is leading the war effort. And to a large extent, much greater extent than people realize, it was Congress rather than President Lincoln, especially in the earlier years of the war. Could the Republicans, who were completely untried as a political party, manage to govern? The party only came into existence in 1854, and this was its first majority in Congress. Was the war going to be fought with respect for Southern property, including slaves, or with a ruthlessness that would bring the seceded states to their knees more quickly? Could the Constitution survive the suspension of civil rights in the name of national security? A concern that's still with us today in wartime. How is the war going to be paid for? Would its financial burden break the Northern economy? It was feared by many that it would. What should white Americans do about slavery? Could Republicans prevent their party from splitting between anti-slavery radicals and those who were willing to tolerate slavery so long as it was contained in the South? Bear in mind that the Democratic Party had already split, not in two, but in three. Southerners had left, with the exception of Andrew Johnson, gone. They were gone. The Northern Democrats split again between pro-war Democrats who tended to back the Republicans and anti-war Democrats who were very virulently opposed to the war. And if we have time, I'll get to one of those gentlemen a bit later. More questions. Were African Americans going to be recruited to serve in the army? If they were, would white soldiers refuse to fight alongside them? This is an often debated question. After the war was won, assuming that the North won it, nobody was confident. Should the Southern states be broken up? Should Confederates be prosecuted as war criminals? There was no consensus on any of these subjects. And at the same time, the suspicion of strong central government and a strong executive is very, very deeply embedded in the North, as well as the South. Many Unionists, especially in the border states, the so-called loyal border states like Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, regarded any tampering with slavery as a threat to basic property rights. I'm going to quote a pro-slavery unionist from Maryland who said, "If you take from us today our right to hold slaves, how long will it be before you will take from us some other constitutional right?" So this is a debate that's taking place in the North as well. And in short, measured by the urgency of what they faced, these questions that I've quickly outlined here, the two wartime Congresses, numbers 37th and 38th, were incredibly productive. They were among the most productive in American history. And I'm going to quote Ohio Senator John Sherman, a Republican who's the brother of the famous General William Tecumseh Sherman. And much later in life, he's the author of the Sherman Antitrust Act. And Sherman predicted that the laws that these Congresses passed will be a monument to good or evil. They cover such vast sums, delegate and regulate such vast powers, and they are so far-reaching in their effects that generations will be affected, well or ill, by them. So, in short, Congress raised hundreds of thousands and finally millions of troops for the Union. It instituted the first military draft and volunteers ran out. It pushed consistently against Lincoln for more aggressive generals, a harsher strategy against the South, and for the recruitment of African Americans. Congress, as I will probably make clear a couple of times, was considerably more in advance of Lincoln on some of these issues. And Lincoln followed Congress at many points more than he led it. In providing financing for the war, this is where William Pitt Fessenden comes in quite boldly. Congress created the first national currency, the forerunner of the Internal Revenue Service, the foundation of the Federal Reserve System, and other financial acts that were imperative to fighting and winning the war. In addition, I'm going to mention three other things Congress did during the war, which aren't typically remembered as wartime acts, but they were the Homestead Act, which opened up the West to settlement on federal land, the act that established the Transcontinental Railroad that would carry the railroad all the way to California, the Land Grants Colleges Act, which would lay the groundwork for the public state university systems nationwide. The war made all these possible. The ideas had been around for a while, but the South had bottled these measures up in Congress for fear that too much of the West would be settled by free staters, people who opposed slavery, and it would bring in more free states. They were probably right about that. And finally, the widespread monitoring of anti-war dissidents, and there were a great many in the North, created a precedent for the government's surveillance of private communications and allegedly unpatriotic political activity, including simply speech, that has sometimes in our own era become a worrisome aspect of public policy. Think back to the day, months and years right after 9/11. So this isn't a book about politics in the abstract. It's a book about people. It's about the men who, and we're all men, the men who piloted Congress through these 4 tumultuous years. Kathleen, let's go to the next image. And I'm going to introduce you to the 4 most important men who loom large in the book. This friendly soul is Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania. Truly a remarkable man. He should be as well known to us as any figure in American history. Thaddeus Stevens was probably the most radical man in Congress. He was a Vermonter by birth, made his career in Pennsylvania, brilliant lawyer. He was one of the relatively few men, even among abolitionists, who had no color prejudice and who had no inhibitions about meeting with, dining with, visiting with African Americans at the time. He's also one of the comparatively few people of the era who, I feel anyway, would be at home in the America that we live in today, even with all its contention. And let's go to the next one, Kathleen. This is Benjamin Wade of Ohio, often known as Bluff Ben, another two-fisted, take no prisoners abolitionist, very forceful man. He and Stevens both were among those who really pressured Lincoln month after month, even year after year, to appoint more aggressive generals to fight the war harder, and also pressed relentlessly for recognition of the rights of African Americans and to terminate slavery earlier. Ben Wade's most significant role during the war is one that isn't well understood or widely known today. He was the chairman of something, the name is pretty cumbersome, the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, or just the Joint Committee. And so what was that all about? Why does it matter? The Joint Committee was established by Wade and a couple of other radicals right after the totally unexpected and shocking defeat at Bull Run in 1861. It was incomprehensible to them that the Federal Army could have been defeated the way it was. And the Joint Committee, which met for 4 years, hundreds and hundreds of times, interviewed and often interrogated leading generals and other officers about how battles were fought, won, or lost, more often lost, especially in the eastern area of the eastern theater of the war. And they rode herd tightly on the military, always pushing for a more forceful war effort. Where does Lincoln fit into this? I'll try to work him in later. You'll realize, you may already have, that I'm not talking much about Abraham Lincoln. One, I said, because often it was Congress that led the political side of the war. Two, because the presidency of the 19th century was not the same as the presidency that we are accustomed to in the 20th century. Throughout the 19th century, with very rare exceptions, dating right from the founding of the country, Congress was regarded as the main repository of political power, not the presidency. And most presidents followed the lead of Congress. Lincoln was indeed more forceful. Lincoln had to take action in 1861, and he did. But he tended often to defer to Congress. He never once refused to answer a question put to him by Congress. He never called upon something called executive privilege, ever. He didn't actually believe in it. And the presidency as we know it, the powerful presidency, really is pretty much a 20th century phenomenon shaped most importantly by Franklin Roosevelt. So when we're in the 19th century, we're in a different political climate here. And while nothing I say here is meant to diminish Lincoln, I think to understand the war, and particularly the political war, you have to change your perspective and recognize that these men I'm talking about here are of huge significance in winning the war. Kathleen, let's go to the next one. And this one is going to be familiar to all your Maine Mainers. This is William Pitt Fessenden, whom I quoted at the beginning. One of the great senators in American history who, like Thaddeus Stevens, really deserves to be far better known than he is, at least outside Maine. I mean, it's a wonderful photograph too, this terrific profile here. And he, as many of you, those of you who live in Portland probably know some of the details, so I won't dwell on them too much, but of course he lived in Portland. He began his professional life as a lawyer there and entered electoral politics in Portland, and he lived in a marvelous house that's still standing. It can't be visited, it's a private house. In fact, it maybe housed more than one family, I don't know, but it's a marvelous house, still there. And Kathleen, I think at some point you could mention what the location is for listeners and viewers and so on. And his papers are at Bowdoin College, where I did, as I said, a great deal of research. And they're wonderful to read. He was extremely articulate. He was, as so many of these men were, there were great letter writers. And if you ever have a chance, and I believe many of his papers are now online, which doesn't require you to actually go to the library. But they're well worth reading for the context of the war and because he loomed so large in the state of Maine. I think what I would like to do here is, if I may, I'm going to read just a very small bit from the book, because there's a relationship between Thaddeus Stevens and William Pitt Fessenden. And what's the relationship? Basically, they are the money men. Thaddeus Stevens is chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. Fessenden is chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. And between them, they are more important than anyone else at shaping financial policy. And bear in mind, the Union went into the war broke. The Treasury was empty. And money had to be found. It's not maybe the sexiest aspect of waging a war, but no war can be won or fought without spending a lot of money for paying troops, feeding them, buying horses for the cavalry, cannon for the artillery, fodder for the animals, ships for the Navy, and so on. And it finally cost about $1 million a day to wage the war, which was unimaginable in 1861. Anyway, I'm going to read just a little bit here. So as chairman, respectively, of the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee, the responsibility for creating the financial machinery commensurate with the government's need fell to Fessenden and Stevens. Both men understood better than the Secretary of the Treasury that a strong and trusting relationship between the Treasury and Northern moneymen, capitalists, was imperative. Their combined energies were worth entire armies in the field. The two had much in common. They were skillful tacticians, lawyers by training, single-mindedly committed to the Union, and bred from the same rocky New England soil. Stevens, as I said, though he made his career in Pennsylvania, was born in Danville, Vermont. Both could be harsh and imperious. And you can see that a bit in Fessenden's face here. Colleagues sometimes referred to Stevens, Thaddeus Stevens, as the chairman of the Committee of Mean Ways, while Fessenden was well known to have, I'm quoting, no patience for humbug and no tolerance for bores. Now, the self-contained Fessenden was reserved to the point of iciness, while Stevens, by contrast, though not exactly gregarious, was one of the most flamboyant men in the house, a driver, bitter, quick as electricity, with his sarcastic, blasting wit. Stevens was notorious as one of the house's leading abolitionists, as I said. The great mogul of abolitionism, a newspaper called him. Fessenden counted himself a pragmatist on the subject of slavery, though his father was a passionate abolitionist. William Pitt Fessenden was not. There is an Oedipal element to this, which I'm not going to go into. I mean, there has to be, because he had issues with his father. But at any rate, he was a pragmatist on the subject of slavery, yet he could be unexpectedly touched. In July, a visitor to Fessenden's home, July 1861, a visitor brought with him a small enslaved child, because slavery is still legal in Washington at this point. The child played on the carpet and chattered for an hour, impressing Fessenden with his intelligence. Fessenden wrote afterward to a friend, "The thought that it was owned like a dog by one of its fellow creatures made me utter fresh maledictions," curses, on an institution which upholds such an atrocity. He cooperated with the radicals, anti-slavery radicals, throughout the war, and his voting was unimpeachable. Fessenden's workload was immense. The man never slept. He was never in good health. He had appalling abdominal pains, but he never slept. He worked and worked and worked. His letters express this quite colorfully. All government appropriations were channeled through his committee. Also, as the floor manager for many bills, and all the bills bearing on finance, he drove debate forward impatiently, literally, figuratively, rather, cracking a whip, dismissing amendments out of hand when he could, pushing to shorten debate when he couldn't, often mocking speakers, including his fellow Republicans, when he felt they talked too long. I'm going to quote, "We come here to meet a crisis," he tartly reminded them more than once, "not for the purpose of ventilating our rhetoric upon questions that have been ventilated enough." Remarked an observer, a journalist, I think. Fessenden believed firmly in leaving all the jabber to others and being content to work like a dog. So I gave you a brief summary a bit earlier of the financial measures that Fessenden and Stevens and their allies brought into being in Congress. I want to get fairly quickly to the Q&A, assuming that there are people out there who are just jumping out of their chairs with questions for me. But before I do that, I want to at least briefly talk about one more man. Kathleen, could we go to the next one? Now, this gentleman, this rather bland-looking fellow, was named Clement Laird Vallandigham. He was an Ohio Democrat from the city of Dayton. And he is, my book focuses primarily on the Republican reformers, generally then called radicals, who pushed the Republican agenda through Congress. I before did say, however, there was a virulent anti-war opposition. Clement Vallandigham led it. He was a Stephen Douglas Democrat before the war. He proudly said he would never vote a penny for the military during the war. He was an unadulterated racist who was very, as so many Democrats were and some Republicans, extremely open about views that make you blanch when you read them today. So I'm not going to read them, but you can use your imagination. He was what in those days was called a negrophobe. That was a very, very common term. The term racist wasn't in use anyway. Vallandigham denounced the war month after month after month, and fostered, tacitly, if not actively fostered, subversive activities in the North. He didn't set off any bombs under railway lines, but others did. Others who admired him did, mainly in the Midwest, but not only in the Midwest. And he was so great a thorn in the side of the war effort that in 1863, well, first he was gerrymandered out of his seat quite ruthlessly by the Republican majority. He was gerrymandered out of his seat, and then he was arrested for his speech, mind you, for what was regarded as traitorous speech, which really was basically anti-war speech, but was charged to him as treason. Northerners, even Republicans, reacted so angrily to anybody being arrested for his speech that the government instead then took him out of jail and expelled him to the Confederacy. He was taken to Confederate lines in Tennessee and pushed across. The Confederates, it turned out, even though they were thrilled to have a man as damaging to the war effort active in the North, they didn't want him in the South, where he was of no use to them. So they quickly ferried him across the South, put him on a boat in Charleston, got him to Bermuda. He went from Bermuda to Canada, went down the St. Lawrence River, and spent the next year and a half sitting in exile in Canada, plotting to attempt to become governor of Ohio. And he was indeed the nominee, the Democratic nominee. He was beaten, however. Very interesting character, and he raises questions about free speech in wartime that even if one can't respect his politics of the day, the civil liberties issues are still very, very pertinent, I think. So I treated him at some length in the book as well, and he was a way into addressing the opposition to the war in many parts of the North. Let's go to the next image. As I said, he was the anti-war Democrats were called Copperheads. And this was a very often repeated cartoon image of the war in the North. And you see 3 Copperheads. And any Northerner who saw this would visualize one of these as Clement Vallandigham. And there's the figure of the Union and Liberty about to cut their heads off. And let's go to the next one. Here's Abraham Lincoln. I've already touched on why he does not loom as large in my book as he does in most. The other reason is, incidentally, there are innumerable excellent biographies of Lincoln. There has been almost no writing about what Congress was doing during the war. I like this picture of Lincoln a great deal because it's just before his election was taken, just before his election, no beard, obviously, and his face is much, much less pitted and haggard than we're familiar with. And this is Lincoln at the brink of the war. And as I said when I started, nobody knows what this war is going to bring. Lincoln did not know until the autumn of 1864 when Sherman captured Atlanta. And finally basically brought the western part of the South to its knees. He did not know and did not even expect whether he was going to win the next election in 1864. There are documents that he left stating what the next president, who would have been a Democrat and an anti-war Democrat, by the way, should do. So nobody. This is a phase looking towards the war before it has actually happened. I think it's my favorite Lincoln photograph. Let's go to the next image. And I'm going to wrap up in a minute. This is really a great place to end, I think, with the pictures. This is the passage of the 13th Amendment in January of 1865. The Union victory is only months away. The country has undergone a tremendous transformation. Congress has as well, not just the country, but Congress. From at the beginning in 1861, by and large, being content to retain slavery where it existed, to emancipating all the slaves by 1865. This event really emancipated African Americans. The Emancipation Proclamation, while a watershed, only emancipated enslaved people in the Confederate States where they were not occupied by federal troops. In other words, where almost no people were actually freed, but it was nonetheless important. But this is in a way the moral climax of the war. And and people knew it at the time. These are congressmen, senators throwing their hats in the air, and the descriptions in newspapers, there's some in my book, of what it felt like in that room at the time will still bring tears to your eyes, because Congress at that moment and all Americans knew that something had fundamentally changed in the country, and it's in a way the real beginning of the struggle still ongoing, as we all know, to create a genuinely fair and biracial, multiracial America. So I think that's a nice place to stop and see if there are any questions. Kathleen, I guess we'll hear them, or how will we do this?
Yep, so I already have one question for you. And thank you so much. What a fascinating topic, and the book sounds really wonderful, really interesting. Laura asks, or she says that she's already read the book. She loved it, and the detail about the 37th and 38th Congresses. She asks, given how important Pitt Fessenden was to Lincoln and the Union's success in the Civil War, why do you think he isn't more well known, like Stanton, Chase, or Stewart?
Yeah, that I personally find, thank you, Laura. I personally find that a perplexing question. He had, well, okay. Here are my thoughts. Here are my thoughts on. I've reflected on it quite a bit, actually. One, he died pretty soon after the war. He died in 1870, and he wasn't there. Although he played a significant role. One we might debate, actually, in Reconstruction, that he was one of the pivotal votes, maybe the pivotal vote, in declining to convict Andrew Johnson during the impeachment hearings. Pitt Fessenden didn't believe it was the right thing to do. And he also did not want to see Ben Wade, who you saw earlier, who was in line to become president, because there was no vice president at the time, okay? And he just didn't like Wade. He respected him as a fighting unionist during the war, but he considered him a bit of a wild man. And there's a grain of truth to that, although I'm a great fan of Wade as well. Why else? His personality was not flamboyant. He was self-contained. He was a real, almost stereotypical New England Yankee. Very reserved, unlike many members of Congress it was an era of flamboyance. Though he was a great orator. He was a very good speaker. You read his speeches. By the way, all these debates and discussions are online. You can access them through the Library of Congress website, the Congressional Globe, GLOBE, was the forerunner of the Congressional Record. So you can read all these people have been talking about. Many of those debates are pretty good. So I think it's a bit of a mystery. It's a bit of a mystery. I don't have a great answer. But those two things are what, well, I also think because of that vote on impeachment, his reputation among the radicals who then dominated the Republican Party dropped. Third thing, and I don't know how far out on this limb I want to go, he had a great rivalry with Hannibal Hamlin. They were competitors as leader of the Maine Republican Party at the time. Really serious rivalry. And at the time, arguably, I think Hamlin, after the war, possibly came out a bit on top of that. So there was a personal element here, but I'm not sure how much to weigh that.
Thank you. I know you mentioned, you and I were talking earlier today about Fessenden's, his physical presence still in Portland, Maine. You mentioned his home, which that building is on State Street in Portland, and in the 30s became a monastery or a convent for the Sisters Adorers of the Precious Blood, which was a cloistered Catholic facility. And I want to say just within like the last year or so, they left. The last couple of sisters that were there left, and the building was sold. And I think as we speak is being converted into housing, like apartment housing. But that building still stands. And there's not one, not two, but 3 streets in Portland that are named after Fessenden, and some locals might be familiar with this. In the neighborhood where you find the University of Southern Maine, kind of between I'd say like between Brighton and Forest Avenue, you have 3 streets right next to each other, William Pitt and Fessenden, and they're all named after him. And of course, he has a close connection to Maine Historical Society through Henry Longfellow's family. So Maine Historical Society cares for the childhood home of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And for a time, Fessenden was engaged to one of Henry's sisters, his sister Elizabeth. They were going to be married. But sadly, Elizabeth died very young. She was like 21 or 22. She had tuberculosis and she died before they got married. But we have an image of him in the Longfellow house. We still have a silhouette. And every once in a while, someone will point it out, ask who it is. And just as Laura was wondering, and we were wondering here, when I say the name, sometimes I expect maybe it'll ring a bell or two. And it almost never does. And when you talk a little bit about who he was and what he did, people are always, oh, interesting. But he isn't very well known, not even in his own hometown.
Yeah, I think he certainly is a figure who's ripe for rediscovery, frankly. And I think there have been two very good biographies. But by comparison, Thaddeus Stevens in Pennsylvania was virtually airbrushed out of the story and remembered solely as a warped and vile character in the brilliant but deeply racist film Birth of a Nation. Stevens, I know that the small city of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where he made his home, very, very well, and I've been involved in saving the Stevens house and so on. And that's currently in the process of being turned into a museum after all these many
Wow.
years. And he will be restored and I think become better known as a towering political man of that period. And I hope that there are souls out there who have something like that in mind for William Pitt Fessenden.
For William, yeah, that would be.
Great. We remember Henry Clay, we remember Daniel Webster, and the opprobrious John C. Calhoun, who did more to undermine American democracy than any other major politician. Yeah. And you have in Fessenden a man who did more than most to save American government, Republican government, and to win this war, which couldn't have been done without him.
We have another question for you. This one is from Rusty. And he asks, while not a member of Congress, what role did Hannibal Hamlin play in all of this?
Glad you asked, Rusty. Hannibal Hamlin is another one of my favorite, how could they forget him, political figures. And Hamlin was indeed a senator, a very prominent senator before the war. He was plucked out of the Senate to become Lincoln's running mate. Hamlin wasn't very happy about it. He felt it was his duty to become vice president, but he knew, as most vice presidents did, it's not the greatest job in the world. And he and Lincoln didn't have great chemistry. He was picked probably to shore up Lincoln among New England abolitionists, where Lincoln was not well known and where there was some skepticism about him. I've written at great length, including in this book, by the way, about I think Lincoln's dreadful, dreadful mistake of letting Hamlin go in 1864. Hannibal Hamlin would have been Lincoln's heir had Lincoln kept him in 1864. Hannibal Hamlin was respected by all his peers in the Senate. He was regarded as a serious, reasonable, very capable man, kind of a dry speaker. I mean, you don't find anything denigrating about him at all. Very capable, modest, another kind of self-contained Yankee. But he was perfectly prepared for the presidency. He was also, by the way, a strong, lifelong abolitionist. Imagine what Reconstruction would have been with under Hannibal Hamlin instead of Andrew Johnson. The entire history of this country would be different. That didn't happen. You know, we can play games with might have beens, but it was a tragic error in 1864. Was it Lincoln's personal fault? Well, Lincoln's line is that he just left it up to the convention, hands off. Well, all Lincoln had to do was to say a word, I like Mr. Hamlin. That would have been it. There wouldn't have been any contest. The politics behind Johnson being picked are really intricate. They're absolutely fascinating. They're dramatic. They involve a lot of different people, including tangentially Fessenden, or dare I say, a fear of Fessenden by Charles Sumner. I'm not going to get into the deep in the weeds with this.
Interesting.
It may be more than most people really want to hear. But Hamlin, too, is somebody who really deserves to be better known. After the war, he also faded, regrettably. He was a pure political man. He wasn't flamboyant. He's not the type of personality like Clay or Webster, who people remember generations later.
Thank you so much. Again, this is a really, really interesting topic. Lots of great food for thought. I'm excited to read the book and to learn more. So thank you so much for your time and for sharing this with us this evening. Again, the book is called Congress at War. And you'd be able to purchase the book through the Maine Historical Society museum store. And you can find the museum store, and we'll be able to find the recording of this program and lots of other great online programs and podcasts on our website, mainehistory.org. And you can check out what's coming up with us soon. Did you have anything else you wanted to say?
Well, I just would like to mention my website in case people listening would like to hear anything more, either about this book, or I should say read anything more about this book or other books that I've written. My website, it's just my own name, which I assume people can see on their screen.
And if you say the name of the website, I'll add the text later.
Okay, it's fergusbordewich.com. And even though it's pronounced Bordewich, it's spelled with an H. It's a quirky Norwegian last name. And I want to thank you again, Kathleen, for having me here, and to all the people out there who've tuned in.
Thank you. It was our pleasure. I hope the next time we can collaborate on a program, we'll all be together in person.
Indeed. I look forward to seeing Portland again.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. Yes, thank you everyone for joining us, and have a good evening.
Bye.